Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to this installment of the um, Arctic Security and Defense Forum. It's it's been really exciting so far to see people show up every week and also kind of to see the same faces come up. I feel like we're really starting to make a community, so it's very exciting to see everyone here. My name is Olivia Houck. I'm one of the co-collaborators of this forum. We also have Tinn, who is um, offline today a little bit. So I am here to introduce us. So I am very excited to introduce Dr. Romain Chuffart, who is hopefully I can say an old friend of mine. We met many years ago, and it's been really exciting to see his career just kind of take off and see where it's gone in that regard. So Dr. Romain Chuffart is the current Nansen Professor in Arctic Studies at the University of Akureyri in Iceland. He is also the president and managing director of the Arctic Institute Center for Circumpolar Security Studies. He holds a PhD in law from the University of Durham, or Durham University in the United Kingdom, and his research areas include human rights and the rights of Indigenous peoples, international environmental law, Arctic cooperation, and ocean governments. And so I'm really excited because I think he's adding such a needed perspective to our group. So with that, I am just very excited to hear about your presentation. Rama, it's all yours.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much to both Phil and Olivia for the invitation to present my research, and also to present my research to such a distinguished crowd, and also for the kind introduction, Olivia. I think we can say we're friends. Um, and as Olivia said, my name is Dr. Romain Chuffart. I currently work as an Nansen Professor in Arctic Studies at the University of Akureyri, where my main role is to promote collaboration and cooperation on the topic of Arctic governance between Norway and Iceland. So this is even more fitted to present today. Um, and today, as you can see on the slide, I will be talking about CI's geoengineering between climate security and environmental justice based on a paper I co-wrote and published 1 year ago in a academic journal called the Polar Journal with Aaron Cooper at Stavanger University in Norway, Dr. Corinne Wood-Donnelly at Nord University, also in Norway, in Bodø, and Dr. Laura Seddon, who was formerly at Durham University in the UK, where I was based as well until last year. The way I have structured this talk is basically, and Olivia told me that I have between 40 and 45 minutes, so I'll try to be focused. But the way I have structured this is really alongside the expertise of the different co-authors we had for the paper. So Laura Seddon's expertise as a geographer is on sea ice and the production of knowledge around sea ice monitoring. Corinne, as a international relations slash, I guess, political geographer, is on ice sovereignty. Aaron is an international lawyer who focuses on geoengineering, and me also someone who happens to work with international law, with expertise on indigenous rights, environmental justice, and also from, I guess, more theoretical angles. Um, and from the get-go, what we can see is really that this idea of geoengineering is has been thought about for more or less the past 20 odd years. And if you only focus on the image on the slide, it looks like pure science fiction. We have this Canadian engineer in 2007 who publishes a paper called Duct Tape Methods to Save the Earth, Re-Ice the Arctic, with a picture of what can only be described as a floating wind power offshore rig with ice cannons. And but more than science fiction, this idea of re-icing the Arctic has come up really over the past couple of years as a real potential solution to mitigate, or at least buy humanity with a hero capital H, I guess, sometime in the face of climate change. And of course, the usual disclaimer, or this is at least my usual disclaimer when I present this paper, is that you don't have to read between the lines to see that I'm personally not really convinced this is a viable solution. To me, this is not really resisting climate change or fighting planetary crisis. It's more about preserving the status quo without really making the deeper structural changes that would need to happen to care and preserve for the Earth system in a more meaningful way. Um, But why would you want to restore the sea ice in the first place? And hopefully I can make the slides work. Yes, perfect. Is that there's heavy scientific component to sea ice and its monitoring. The sea plays a critical role in regulating the Earth climate, and sea ice reflects sunlight, which contributes to the planet's albedo. It's a process that people who are not familiar with that is a process that helps keep global temperatures in check by reflecting sunlight and some of the heat as well produced by sunlight. As the Arctic sea ice melts, this reflectivity decreases and it exacerbates global warming. We have um, projections as the Arctic sea ice melts that the Arctic Ocean could become seasonally ice-free but as soon as 2050, and those projections keep changing with the IPCC reports as well. And the recent special report on ocean and cryosphere also by the UNFCCC. Um, and so it's really an alarming scenario and it has far-reaching implication, not only for climate security, but also for environmental justice. And that's something I really wanted to talk about in this presentation. In this context, what we mean by an ice-free Arctic doesn't mean totally without ice, and that's something we have to clarify as well. But with transformation of the local frozen environments from older, thicker sea ice, and that being replaced by thinner, more fragile ice, to such an extent that the ice really loses all its structural coherence. And the targets that we have, so exceeding 1.5 degrees Celsius or even 2 degrees Celsius, which were the targets, or one the aspirational and one the real target of the Paris Agreement, could also trigger multiple climate tipping points. And the loss of sea ice, as well as the loss of the Greenlandic ice sheet, are often seen as one of those many tipping points in the Earth system. This is really how sea ice monitoring and sea ice decline come to play a role in climate responses and also in the fight against climate change. This obviously this is very, I mean, the monitoring of sea ice and using data to analyze sea ice is a very, I guess, science-heavy perspective. But beyond Western scientific value of sea ice for climate monitoring, sea ice also has, I guess, what could be termed a onto epistemological value for Arctic communities and Arctic indigenous people who live or whose culture depend on frozen ocean spaces. For example, there are many primary and secondary literature from Inuit themselves that point to sea ice as not just a physical entity whose values gain through the climate crisis, but also an integral part of their culture, spirituality, identity, and so on. So in that sense, it's more than just a resource or habitat. It's a living part of their world, a living part of the culture. And for these communities, and you can see that on the slide as well, the loss of sea ice is not just an environmental issue. It is an environmental issue, but it's also a cultural and existential threat. And we can see that the disappearance of sea ice undermines food security, disrupts traditional practices, threatens the transmission of indigenous knowledge or Inuit knowledge in that case between generations. And as the Arctic warms, indigenous peoples all across the Arctic face the possibility of being disconnected from the environment that has shaped their way of life. And that's really something that all of which have implication for indigenous rights, self-determination, sovereignty, and agency. What I put on the slide here is a report by the Inuit Circumpolar Council from 2008 that specifically looks at sea ice. And we have this quote, in wintertime, sea ice is a highway. In summertime, it is the open sea. Sea ice is an integral component of life in the Arctic. And we we also have, or we can also see here, there's no real distinction between land and sea, in the same way Western legal ontology would differentiate the two. So again, another quote from the report is, land is anywhere our feed, dock teams, and snowmobiles can take us. And as the Arctic environment changes, especially here, sea ice, indigenous communities, Inuit communities face the erosion of the cultural foundation. And this is really, when we think about the impact of climate change, this is really what we have to take in mind. There's not only environmental security implications or climate security implications, there's also social, cultural security implications. And this is very much where an activity like geoengineering or potential activities such as geoengineering found themselves, and in the discourse in which they find themselves as well. So for people who don't know about geoengineering, it refers to large-scale deliberate interventions in the Earth climate system to counteract climate change. It is generally divided, as you can see on the slide, into two broad categories. So we have greenhouse gas removal. So you just imagine the easier picture of greenhouse gas removal would just be carbon capture and storage. So techniques that remove carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, such as I said, as air capture, direct air capture, so vacuuming out the CO2 emissions from the atmosphere. Also ocean fertilization, so dumping air carbon into the ocean, or to make dumping chemicals into the ocean so they become more, or they can absorb more CO2. The second one is solar radiation management, and this is really what I want to focus on in this presentation, is methods that reflect sunlight away from the Earth, reducing the amount of heat being absorbed. And examples of that goes from the very radical and very scary injecting aerosols into the stratosphere, marine clouds brightening, to potentially here restoring sea ice. And what we've seen is that even though greenhouse gas removal is being talked about, it is really solar radiation management that has gained attention due to, especially in the Arctic, due to the region's vulnerability to warming. We have, again, these reports coming, as I said at the beginning, from the IPCC, that the Arctic is warming twice to 3 to 4 times the rate of global average. And its traditional emission reduction efforts seems is insufficient to stop or reverse the loss of sea ice. Really, scientists and I would say venture capitalists in this sense, or people who are entrepreneurs, are exploring technological solutions like geoengineering. What's interesting is that if you look at and I'll put my international law hat here, if you look at the Paris Agreement, for example, it's not something like geoengineering doesn't really neatly fall between adaptation and mitigation. It's not really adaptation, you don't adapt. It's not really mitigation, although it tends to be a bit mitigation like, but it's really something that has come to be defined as intervention. And there's no really legal framework around these kind of interventions directly. And in the Arctic, in Arctic geoengineering techniques, we have, as I said, 2 specific techniques being proposed. Three specific techniques being proposed. So Arctic marine cloud brightening, stratospheric aerosol injection, so marine cloud brightening that's involving spraying sea salt particles into the atmosphere to increase cloud reflectivity, and cooling the underlying surface. And this method is thought to potentially slow down the melting of sea ice, but reducing the amount of solar energy being absorbed by the ocean surface or by the surface. And then we have the other one that I already talked about is this involves dispersing reflective particles like sulfur dioxide, so the stratospheric aerosol injection into the stratosphere to mimic the cooling effects of a volcanic eruption. This, in terms of what this would do, is this would reflect sunlight away from the Earth, lowering global temperatures and theoretically stabilizing sea ice. Another technique that we've seen pop up in recent years is also just restoring sea ice with water pumping systems, and I'll go into the details of that a bit more. And we have, as you can see on the slide, many companies or businesses or enterprises being involved in that with Arctic specific focus. So we had the Harvard ScopeX project that was a stratospheric aerosol injection project that was supposed to happen in Northern Europe, in Scandinavia. And it obviously here it faced resistance of Sami indigenous peoples in the region because Harvard wanted to conduct those testing, so the preliminary testing, without having consulted indigenous communities in that region. And we have other different projects, so Arctic Ice Project, that's formerly Arctic 911, Real Ice, and Bright Ice Initiative as well. Real Ice and Bright Ice Initiative, as you can probably guess, they're all about active cooling, so restoring sea ice with water pumping systems. Um, the um, the company I've focused a bit more on in this research in the paper as well is Real Ice, because they started conducting um, scientific research in Cambridge Bay in Nunavut, and they apply for scientific research license. They got it. They did the field testing, the preliminary phase. What's interesting is that they didn't have to go through an environmental impact assessment procedure because it was considered field testing, and that the regulation in Nunavut in northern Canada is a bit less stringent for scientific testing. And what we see here happen is that they did the preliminary testing, I think, in January this year, so early this year, and what they want to do is upscale it to beyond just Cambridge Bay and in broader Canadian waters. Um, we have and what the technology behind that is as you can see on the slide, and this is from their website, is water pumping. So they would drill ice with unmanned autonomous vehicles, go under the ice, have this water pumping system, so pump the water back up, freeze everything, and then have this solidifying or strengthening the ice as a result. So you already have to have ice. So this would just be again restoring it on a larger scale. I think so. I do not work for Real Ice. I don't have any connections with them, but I think this potentially is where the business are going to go, because this seems to be a bit less costly than other sort of geoengineering here. So what is interesting for us in looking about it, or in looking at it from a different perspectives here, so from a international law perspective, from a climate monitoring perspective, and also from a, I guess, geopolitical perspective, so the security element, is that really there's no strong or stringent legal frameworks for sea ice and geoengineering in the current state of international law. So when you think about sea ice law and governance, you have the legal status of sea ice is quite complex. It's poorly defined in international law under the United Convention on the Law of the Sea, which is the staple document that we have for ocean governance in international law. The ice is mentioned primarily in relation to navigation and environmental protection. So you have Article 234 of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea that allows coastal states to implement special environmental regulations in ice-covered areas within the exclusive economic zone. So within a zone where they already have some form of sovereign rights. But this provision is limited in scope and does not really address the broader governance challenges posed by the specific development of CI geoengineering. What Article 234 allows for is the implementation of environmental protection measures in what UNCLOS, or the United Convention on the Law of the Seas, calls ice-covered areas. So the issue here is really that UNCLOS or the convention doesn't really see sea ice as something to govern. So and that comes from perhaps, and that's perhaps a bit too much international legal history for this morning. That comes really from the early 20th century discussion around sea ice in Western legal thoughts, particularly around the use of sea ice potentially as territory, and this idea that the law of international law didn't really comprehend sea ice or understand sea ice quite well because it was neither water nor land. So it was hard to just categorize it for the purpose of the legal regime. And then throughout all these discussions, obviously, I'm saying obviously, unfortunately, but obviously Indigenous perspectives on the use of ice that was reflected in the report I showed earlier, and also their rights were notably absent. So you can imagine when the Law of the Sea Convention was negotiated in the 1970s and the 1980s, there was no talks about Indigenous rights, Indigenous sovereignty, Indigenous agency, and even at the especially Indigenous self-determination and sovereignty over ocean spaces, and even more about when it comes to protecting sea ice or claiming sovereignty and self-determination over ice-covered areas. And perhaps the only reference we have of sea ice as potential spaces to be governed is, and that wouldn't come as a surprise if you work in that field, is in the Nunavut Claim Agreement, that really understand ice as something where you can exist when you could culturally and legally have ties to. So this is really, when we think of sea ice and restoration of sea ice and governance of sea ice, this is the context. This is the 101 context we have to bear in mind. And that's the Article 234 of the Law of the Sea Convention, which you can read for yourself on the slide, and I will not read. But really sees, as you can see, ice as hazard and potentially disturbance to shipping more than something to be kept for its own sake here. And what's really interesting is that, as I said, the environmental understanding of the Arctic is deeply rooted in those frameworks as well, and there are potential provisions that could help us or potential international legal obligations that could help us govern sea ice geoengineering, so the production of more sea ice in the Arctic, for example. And what we can see is that under the Law of the Sea Convention, There are some relevant provisions, as I said, including Article 234, but also broader obligations to protect and preserve the marine environment. So at Article 192, and more specific provisions and obligations to coastal states. So we have at Article 194 a general duty to prevent, reduce, and control pollution of the marine environment. Again, you can ask yourself whether creating more sea ice is contributing to preventing, reducing, and controlling pollution of the marine environment. That's a very narrow reading of that. And then more specifically, pollution resulting from the introduction of new technologies, as well as so an obligation not to pollute by introducing new technologies. And you can really see that perhaps that doesn't cover the ice geoengineering per se, but more the ocean fertilization component of geoengineering. So, and also here in this case, potentially linking with the recent BBNJ agreement, so the recent agreement for biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. That's an international agreement covering the Arctic as well, and especially the high sea portion of the Central Arctic Ocean. And with that, there's also a precautionary and approach and environmental obligations for activities beyond national jurisdictions. In this case, we're not at the stage quite yet where CI geoengineering would be deployed in areas beyond national jurisdiction, especially in the Arctic. We're getting to areas beyond national jurisdictions, so the high seas is quite challenging sometimes. Other obligation, maybe not in the law of the sea or in ocean governance, but in other international agreements that we have, would be to in Article 5 of, or under Article 5 of the 2013 Marine Geoengineering Protocol to the 1972 Convention on the Prevention of Marine Pollution by Dumping of Waste and other matter. The convention is in force. It's referred to as the London Convention, but the geoengineering protocol is not in force. We also have the decision of the Convention on Biological Diversity, a couple of decisions, and those decisions put a moratorium on geoengineering. Again, when we think of CI geoengineering, especially when we think of sea ice restoration, does that fall under the moratorium? That's even harder to say. And in the Arctic specifically, we have Article 9 of the 2017 Agreement on Enhancing Arctic Scientific Cooperation, which offers a governance framework that include guarantees for deploying a precautionary principle and also for consultation with local populations. So perhaps this could be an avenue to govern those kind of activities here. From an even broader perspective in international law, as I've already mentioned, there are two key principles in international environmental law, so the precautionary principle and the principle of no harm. And they're obviously relevant or very relevant to geoengineering. The precautionary principle suggests that in the absence of scientific certainty about the risks of an activity, states should, for lack of a better word, err on the side of caution to prevent environmental harm. And the no harm principle requires states to take measures to prevent activities within their jurisdiction from causing harm to other states or the global environment. While I guess these principles provide a solid foundation for regulating geoengineering, they're really not, or what we've come to realize, especially in the research I conducted, is that they're not sufficient to address the unique challenges posed by sea ice geoengineering in the Arctic, potential liability also for sea ice could be an issue. And for one, sea ice, because sea ice is not clearly defined as something that is governed in international law, it makes it difficult to apply existing governance frameworks as well. Additionally, geoengineering technologies are often pursued by private actors or scientific institutions, which complicates or make it more complex, the issue of accountability in this sense. When we talk about international obligation, the buck falls on the state, and it is the state that has to make sure that private parties and private actors within that its jurisdiction follow all the rules and its legal obligation, but again, it complexified the nature of regulating sea ice or a complex issue like geoengineering. The the development of marine geoengineering is also something that has been said to have an impact on human rights as well. So, sorry, excuse me. So what happens here is that with the development of what has been termed new technologies for climate protection, we have seen from a human rights perspective, the UN or the United Nations Human Rights Council that has published a report on the potential impact of geoengineering on human rights or the enjoyment of human rights. We have a resolution from last year, I believe, from the Human Rights Council, resolution 4814, that tasked the advisory committee of the Human Rights Council with studying the impact of new technologies for climate protection. They use that term, but what they mean is geoengineering. And the report, as I said, asserted that geoengineering might be incompatible with human rights or the enjoyment of human rights. It emphasized the precautionary principle again, and also urged states not to develop geoengineering technologies due to the high risks and uncertainty. This is particularly relevant for the rights of present and future generations, the report emphasized, and also is relevant given the availability of proven low-risk technology. So again, this precautionary approach of perhaps looking at other pathways and avenues to solve, quote unquote, the climate crisis. What the report or what the advisory committee of the Human Rights Council highlighted is that new technologies for climate protection could disproportionately affect marginalized groups, such as Indigenous peoples, who also may be more exposed to negative impact of the deployment of such technology. So for Indigenous people here is a really loss-loss situation because they face the brunt, or they often face the brunt of climate change, and those kind of potential solutions could also add another stressor on their livelihoods and also on their rights and right to self-determination as well. The reports from the Human Rights Council call for the implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, especially the standard around the right of to free, prior, and informed consent, which is consulting before, so prior, free, that's free of coercion, and informed, that's with all the knowledge about the deployment of an activity or a project, before any measures are adopted, and before any measures are adopted that may affect Indigenous peoples. As I said, this we have seen a lot of projects, or we have not a lot, excuse me, we have seen a few projects where proponents of geoengineering have been wanting to deploy testing or do testing. I refer to the Scopex, the Harvard Scopex project at the beginning, which failed to respect the rights of Sami Sami people to free, prior, and informed consent. There was also some opposition by Alaska Native communities to the Arctic Ice Project. So we see that there's still a lack of consultation as well when it comes to those projects being deployed in the Arctic. And while the Human Rights Council reports provide, again, a solid framework for human rights, especially in the context here of geoengineering and CI geoengineering, it does not fully address the oceanic dimension of indigenous rights. What we see here again is a lack of this understanding of land and sea, who can have sovereignty over what. And then that ocean spaces and ice covered spaces can also be part of indigenous people's traditional lands and territories. Uh, excuse me. So here we really have, and what we need to push for is more from an international legal perspective to create more climate security and to fight for environmental justice. What we need to do is what lawyers would say regime interaction. So you're looking at different regimes and how they interplay with each other, how potentially CI geoengineering is being regulated, and also how in ocean governance, but also from an indigenous rights, human rights perspective. Um, and what we've seen, what's interesting is that in Arctic governance, while recognizing indigenous rights and claims to greater autonomy, I should say, there's still a lot of power imbalances, and rights are not fully respected. And especially when we have new projects like this, who could help to some extent provide some form of solutions alongside other solutions of adaptation and mitigation to the current climate crises. It's also worth mentioning that they often come at costs. In here, we have a cost of indigenous rights and potentially impact on the enjoyment of indigenous rights as well. So the major gap here is that when we look at the challenges, and is really about the challenge is the inclusion of indigenous knowledge for or into the decision-making process when we think about CI geoengineering, when we think about geoengineering at all, or climate solution happening in the Arctic, and also to try to merge indigenous knowledge with scientific knowledge, fully respecting the rights of indigenous people as well. And that relies on potentially developing a more robust legal framework to regulate new new technology for climate protection. There's a typo on the slide here. I should say NTCP in the context of geoengineer CIs. From an even more legal perspective, and perhaps even a domestic legal perspective, there's also, as I hinted at earlier, the issue of liability. So who would be liable for what when it comes to sea ice and geoengineer sea ice? Is there some level of liability to the company providing that service as well? If, for example, that sea ice breaks away and hits a ship, which sea ice tend to do, especially as the climate is destabilized even further. And also, and something I wanted to come time and time again in this presentation is really linking CI geoengineering, ocean governance with a rights-based approach as well. So embedding the rights of indigenous peoples into those activities to make sure that those activities do not come at the cost of indigenous peoples enjoying their right to self-determination, their right to sovereignty, and also their right to being consulted. And on top of that, there all of the other human rights obligations that states should follow under international law. So again, does that mean I'm advocating for geoengineering? Certainly not. I've expressed my doubts about the capacity to change the status quo at the beginning of this talk. But as I guess as I see that it is moving forward, we really need, or is being deployed, we really need to think about those potential issues, so not to again um, uh, produce more injustices. And that's really where, as I titled this, climate security and environmental justice, is really where the environmental justice comes in here, is that you have to have these a robust legal framework not to produce any injustices as well. And it is exactly because of the deployment of certain technologies, and because the deployment of such technologies fits into the I guess climate solution discourse, that it's important to focus on vulnerabilities and also build some form of I guess resistance to that as well, by talking about the core need for justice. And under justice, as I said, and I'm repeating myself now, you need to have a look at a rights-based approach to justice as well. On that note, thank you so much. And again, thank you, Olivia, and Phil for inviting me. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much, Roma. This was fantastic. And just, I'm so excited to really bring this perspective into our series and into this community. So everyone in the audience, if you have any questions, please put it in the Q&A section, and I will make sure to ask them. But I get the best part of this whole series. I get to ask the first question, which is the reason why I do this. So I think what I really appreciate about your talk is this broadening the framework of thinking about the tech, like in our thinking about technological solutions to current important problems. It's not just thinking about communities that would be harmed or rights, but it's thinking about the actual definition of the variables themselves. As, technologists or as scientists or as people who are focusing on security, we have a very, need I say, Western understanding of what ice is. It is measured, it is, it is frozen water, but we don't understand the kind of ontological dimensions of what it could mean to indigenous communities. And so really bringing in this understanding that sea ice is not just relegated to numbers that are temperatures or to diagrams, but it actually means something more. And this question of definitions is first off just important that we can understand that there are different definitions to things. But as you really, kind of explicated, how do we bring an understanding of different variables into these technological and economic and governance frameworks when our governance frameworks are really built around our, the Western kind of understanding of what different components of the environment is, what sovereignty is, what property is, etc. And so what are there examples, and this gets into this larger question of bringing Indigenous knowledge into kind of existing frameworks of, rights and things like that, but are there examples of building legal frameworks that are commensurate with Indigenous understandings of land and environment in like other contexts? Is there precedence that can be drawn from in order to bring in these new understandings, or is it more just communication with these groups and really listening to what they say?
That's a very, very good question, Olivia. And I mean, just again, a disclaimer here. I don't speak for any Indigenous communities. I'm not Indigenous myself. I do not identify as Indigenous. I don't think I would fall under any categorizations of Indigenousness. So I'm not. I speak just as a legal expert here. Um, And I think we have some examples to some extent of, let's say, um, activities that we consider are quite bad for climate that have been trying to become more sustainable. When you think of mining, for example, and that question of making it more sustainable is also a question about bringing a social component to that. And what I mean by social component is respect for the rights, human rights, but also in the case of mining happening more than often on indigenous lands, it's also about bringing a conversation around the rights of indigenous peoples. Is that conducive to more indigenous agency and more indigenous self-determination? No, and not to the extent that those rights should be implemented. But at least what rights or the rights-based approach does in this context is really offer us an entry point to talk about those issues, to talk about issues of environmental justice and to broaden the frame of what we mean by by environmental justice as well. So environmental justice in this context is also, yes, by protecting the environment, but also by protecting the people who depend on this environment. And at the end of the day, when we link environmental justice and human rights, it's also what we do is recognizing that we cannot be separated as humans from the environment, and that as a result, we need to have a rights-based approach to those kind of issues as well. Um, I think, but as you rightly highlighted, what this does is also about trying to challenge the balance of power in those discussions. So both an entry point, but an entry point to do what, to achieve what, an entry point to really challenge the balance of power, to give more voice to people who have been discriminated against, who have come to seen the violence or colonial violence to begin with, but also environmental violence as well. So really what this does, and is really about, yeah, as I said, an entry point. In terms of successful models, that's even harder to say. I started with sustainable mining, which is a horrible term to describe an activity that is ongoing. But I think in the Arctic especially, what we've seen is different organization or different institutional level that have implemented to some extent a right to participation and consultation. So when we think of the Arctic Council, for example, this is not said verbatim, this is not said per se, but this is a right to participation of indigenous organizations that do represent indigenous communities and peoples who have some form of a voice as well. But how is that built? Again, it's built around respect and promotion of their rights. So rights here allows us for an entry point.
Excellent. Thank you for such a comprehensive answer. And I think I really appreciate what you said. One of the reasons I got into Arctic studies and things is because of this question of how do you govern sea ice? How do you govern, parts of the environment that are melting or changing, and like how our understandings of measurement and numbers doesn't apply a lot of the time, especially in such a variable environment. And so bringing in that kind of other understanding of these dimensions to complicate this process in service to environmental justice is so important. So I'm actually going to change, I'm going to swing in another way and say, how is this being monetized? Who is funding these companies? What's in it for them? What countries are they based in? Are these government contracts? Like what is the economics of this? And like, yeah.
This again, and I think this is such an excellent question because at some point in writing this paper and doing this research, Aaron Cooper and myself, we were down the rabbit hole of trying to map the connections between those actors deploying or selling an idea of geoengineering, really, and the connection to local authorities potentially or governments, and the funding sources. So. And I'll focus not because I want to just like point at one in particular, but because that's the one we looked at the most. So the company called Real Ice, I think it was started as a scientific project in at Cardiff University in the UK, and now it has ties to the Cambridge Centre for Climate Repair. So it's a very UK-based organizations. I think what they've done quite well here is involving some Indigenous knowledge holders in the process as well. But they funding, so to say, if you think that Cambridge University, or if you know that Cambridge University is a public organization in the UK, it's government funded, basically. It's that very like roundabout way that universities and academia is funded by the government while still being somehow independent, I guess. Um, the Harvard Scopex project, again, very obvious who is funding that. Harvard University was funding that. It didn't go through, so the project itself didn't go through, again because it faced backlash from indigenous organization, namely the Sami Council in Finland, Norway, Sweden, and the Kola Peninsula. So a non-governmental, organization representing the rights of the Sami people. Um, the other two that we looked at, Arctic 911, that had to rebrand itself after the first Trump election as Arctic Ice Initiative, obviously with all the cool 911. That was wasn't that really good, especially Ice as well. Ice 911 that wasn't very good. But they rebranded themselves, and they a private business operating as a 501c3 in or registered as a 501c3, so that's a non-profit organization in the United States. So they act as a non-profit organization. I think they started more as a venture capitalist or an entrepreneur kind of idea. But really, and I think the was it Bright Ice or the other one I showed on the slide, that's also based in the US, and that's also private business. Um, so it's really a mix of who found those kind of enterprises, or these kind of activities. I think the idea that I have, and this is my personal understanding, not having talked to the people working there, is really to sell an idea, to sell almost a patent that could be upscaled afterwards. So, for example, I don't think the idea is to make a lot of money. I think some of them generally act in good faith of trying to, and again, quote unquote, solve the climate crisis. But it's really definitely at some point also trying to sell a project. Especially I think more on the United States side, where the money from, if you try to follow the money, some of the money come from Silicon Valley as well, so from big tech kind of projects. So yeah, so that's interesting to map and to think about, again, as you said, who's funding what and what's in it for them, just beside being very, I don't know, planet friendly.
Yeah, and I think so. We have one time for one more question, and so kind of going off of that, it makes sense that a lot of a lot of this technology is operating within kind of an academic and a scientific framework right now. Is there worry that it could be used for military purposes, or we've talked about in other speakers, this there's suspicion of technology in Arctic spaces, right? The technology that could be used for weather could also be used for military or intelligence and things like that. Is there any discussion or fear or apprehension that this could be used somehow within, for the state to exert power over the environment or for future conflict?
And again, that's an excellent question, especially when we talk about dual use of those technologies, which has been more prominent on the agenda, especially as you said, in Arctic governance, in the Arctic governance sphere. I do believe maybe less so for CI geoengineering. When you think of stratospheric injection, there's definitely some form that could be used for dual use, and there's a fear because of again potentially specific actors and geopolitical actors funding specific projects as well. I think that there might be a fear that this could lead to broader um, uh, or at least lead to some form of weaponization of geoengineering that could result in geopolitical issues there. For CI geoengineering, because it is so targeted, and because you would have to start somewhere, so to apply for a permit somewhere, I think there's less of a risk to do that. At some point, again, these are conducted as scientific testing, scientific activities. So you would have to. The entry point there is very national, and then, as I say, we can go international when we speak about the Arctic. But at some point, you would have to have a sponsoring state in I don't really see the potential for CI geoengineering to be used in such a way. Although, and this is coming back to Article 234 of the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea, if you look at the language in the convention and see that states, coastal states, have more rights and obligations in the EEZ or in the EEZ, as I'm speaking to an American audience, to in ice covered areas. You could also see that potential states or states could potentially refreeze, use that technology to freeze the EEZ and use that to again gain some more environmental rights. Those rights are there for coastal states to take, but obviously the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea didn't think about those kind of technology. They thought about historical or historically ice covered areas. But you could think as a let's say, for example, um, let's pick a state at random, but you could think of Japan, for example, freezing its EEZ and then having a bit more rights to for environmental protection to monitor in its in its EEZ as well. So something like that, where it's very marginal what could happen, but it's also something that has a potential for dual use in a very narrow legal stance, but that would also have broader geopolitical consequences.
Amazing. Yeah, no, this understanding of kind of how technology can actually shift or gain more rights it within
Mhm.
the existing kind of legal framework is so fascinating. Unfortunately, we have come to our time. I wish I could sit and talk to you. I mean, I probably will, but for and ask you 1,000 more questions. Everyone else on the call, thank you so much for being here. As always, it's a pleasure. And for those Americans, I hope you have a wonderful Thanksgiving, and I am excited to see you all in December. Thank you for everything, and always reach out if you have any questions.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah.